Welcome to Chef Marketing Academy. This lecture is on business to business marketing. As you know, in marketing, we have an enormous amount of research primarily focused on consumer packaged goods industries. Since marketing identifies with more branding, targeting, positioning, and less with sales, the focus in marketing has been a lot more on the consumer side, both consumer non-durables as well as consumer durables such as appliances, automobiles. So in the process, people have always asked, what about the business-to-business markets and what about business-to-business companies? Companies that are in industrial raw materials, such as, for example, agricultural commodities, or metals, steel, copper, aluminum, or chemical companies such as a DuPont or Dow Chemicals or whatever the rest of the world companies are. So this lecture is primarily designed for an interest in B2B marketing. The B2B marketing is a lot more sensitive to external environment. Any change in the economy, it impacts in B2B marketing much sooner, faster than it impacts in the consumer markets. For example, in the late 60s again, when I did consulting project on a machine tool industry, and I repeated that later on in the 80s again one more time, I was absolutely astounded to learn that machine tool industry has a feast and a famine phenomenon. Slight change in the economic uncertainty or change, for example, in the interest rates, the industry collapses very quickly. In 4 months, you have a huge industry recession, and then in about a year, it gets back again. I've seen recently in the construction equipment business, for example, where but for the emerging markets, companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, Mahindra and Mahindra from India, and their OEM suppliers, which are people who make components, go on this feast and famine or a roller coaster ride. So how do we protect yourselves from these ups and downs of the company and the industry is the primary focus in this particular lecture. Let me start with some formal presentation and show you some slides. So the title of the presentation is The 7 Keys to Better Business Marketing, which means there are 7 different things companies can do to remove uncertainty that inherently exists in business markets and provide some stability and therefore a proper forecast about revenues in the future and hopefully the profitability in the future. That's the general purpose of this particular lecture. So let me start by showing the first slide. Business markets are often one of the 3 major sectors of the economy. The other 2 sectors are, of course, the agriculture sector and the consumer sector. We are not counting the government sector. Usually you have the government, business, and you have obviously the agriculture sector. So we are now redefining in terms of 3 sectors. So you have the government sector, the industrial sector, the consumer sector by and large. It is in many countries probably the most dominant sector, especially in agricultural economies or traditional economies. There is no as yet consumer market. There is no modern middle class who buys branded packaged consumer goods, such as, for example, the appliances, the automobiles, the cell phones, or grocery products. So largely it is primarily based upon some form of an export orientation, some form of an industrial value-added manufacturing, etc., and it's mostly B2B. So kinds of markets that we include in B2B are commodity markets on the one hand, to capital markets on the other hand. Most of the banking business is really corporate banking, investment banking, not just the consumer banking that we associate with the consumer markets. And of course, we have large industrial manufacturers, both in the aerospace industry, automobile industry, as well as, in fact, the construction equipment industry that I mentioned earlier. And the last area that I include are the outsourcing companies. Lots of business is outsourced. And the outsourcing companies, of course, in the IT industry, we always talk about the outsourcing companies. And now the Indian IT services are becoming major outsourcing companies. But the biggest outsourcing IT company turns out to be IBM. IBM Global Services is a dominant in its own industry. And of course, IBM is a B2B company. So would be the HP, so will be Oracle, so would be SAP. In fact, a lot of Silicon Valley companies are really not consumer-centric companies. They're much more business-to-business companies. So all of these companies are included in this particular lecture that I'm doing it. As I mentioned earlier, business markets are highly sensitive to market prices. And the reason is that the customers are usually very sophisticated. They are also as technically competent as the supplier. They are also engineers, typically scientists. So procurement organization is technically very competent. They have an assessment about the quality of the product, and therefore often, and the competition is highly intense because the markets are concentrated. Only a handful of customers buy lots of the industry's products and services. So given that nature, there is always a strong price sensitivity. And often you have to write RFPs, request for proposal, RFI, request for information. There's a whole procurement process which is different than the consumer markets. So this price sensitivity aspect makes companies often more vulnerable than one would like. Second thing is that they're also very sensitive to all of the market dynamics. Other external factors, such as any kind of a disruptive technology, as it has happened with digital technologies nowadays, for example, or with economic reforms, as it is happening in many, the emerging economies, for example. Global competition is one of the biggest issues in industrial markets. I like to call still this as industrial marketing as opposed to business marketing, so please bear with me on that. And capital markets. These four external drivers, along with regulation to some extent, are very much impact making in B2B markets, and therefore we can talk about why some of the world-class business-to-business marketing companies have failed. Think about the following. In 1984, government announced or actually implemented the breakup of the Bell system, which was the largest telephone company, 1 million employees, one of the largest revenues in the world. And all of a sudden, the 7 baby bells created in the 80s, majority of them are gone now. There is no longer, these are all Fortune 50 companies, not Fortune 500. Multi-billion-dollar companies began through the breakup alone, very similar to the Standard Oil industry breakup right after Great Depression. This breakup of these 7 baby bells, such as Ameritech, NYNEX, Pacific Bell, Bell South, they're all gone. We had in more recent economic recession, failures of the largest banks. Most of them deal business with business-to-business market, such as Wachovia, for example. So the point around here is that we need to find out why good companies fail. And I have a separate book written in this area, Why Good Companies Fail. And the conclusion ultimately is that good companies fail because they are either unwilling or unable to change when the external driver has changed significantly. And as I mentioned earlier, 2 things happening right now are technology evolutions, even in very dumb product categories like mechanical products or electromechanical products. Today we are embedding electronics everywhere, And that changes the whole paradigm by making those machines smarter and smarter. We are making smart grids, power grids all over the world. This is a key driver of change along with globalization and especially global competition. Just to give you an example of the global competition, here comes a tractor company from India called Mahindra and Mahindra. Through acquisitions becomes one of the big tractor companies in China. This is of course the low end of the tractor market, let's say 55 horsepower or less. Now comes to America, where the incumbent company is John Deere, and John Deere is not able to compete at that low end of the market. These are basically even home tractors, home gardening things where you go around the yard if you have a large yard or a little farm or something like that, both for hobby as well as livelihood businesses. So John Deere may decide to exit the small end of the tractor business and try to survive by offering much more sophisticated machines for very large farming and similarly construction equipment. Same thing is true of, for example, Caterpillar. Same thing is true of the Boeing of the world as well as the Lockheeds of the world, Airbus of the world, that small aircraft manufacturing is not generally what they are very good at doing it. It is dominated by Brazil on the one hand, Canada on the other hand, and maybe some other aerospace manufacturer may come in the process. This is all B2B markets. So on the next page, why good companies fail, I have some examples. As I said, if a company is either unable or unwilling to change, the examples are Digital Corporation, one of the great corporations. It's the only company that I know, multi-billion-dollar, where the founder, Ken Olsen, was so unwilling to change over time that on his way out, he destroyed the company at the same time. He strongly believed that nobody can duplicate mainframe computers, especially personal computers cannot do the work of mainframe computers. A brilliant scientist, great company, but it is gone. Now we hear quite a lot about how HP is in trouble, an icon of America. A company that did so very, very well is struggling now to think about whether they should be in the PC business or not. Research in Motion, great Canadian company, one of the major stock traded companies in Canada, along with Bell South and maybe Nortel. And by the way, Nortel also went through a crisis management, is barely surviving. But Research in Motion that makes BlackBerry, very powerful networking behind the scenes, is in serious, I would say, midlife crisis. They don't know where to go with, on the one hand, Apple coming in, while they're basically a business-to-business market, BlackBerry. Somehow the volume and the scale advantage in consumer markets, they are not able to survive. Hopefully they will survive, but the odds don't look very good and there might be an acquisition target. We saw the same thing with Lucent. Lucent had to merge with Alcatel to survive. Again, they are into businesses where legacy is coming in the way and the world is moving on, both from a competition viewpoint, like in the case of Lucent and Alcatel. Competition is not from Europeans and the Japanese, but it is now from Chinese corporations such as Huawei Technologies. And the market is shifting toward wireless technologies more and more from landline technologies, and therefore in wireless, they are not necessarily the dominant players. It is the emerging market suppliers who are becoming a lot more dominant, whether those are handset businesses or those are network infrastructure technologies. Very significant change. So because of that, I wanted to primarily talk about how in business-to-business marketing in the future companies will have to do to survive and thrive at the same time. The business marketing culture can be divided into three categories. Companies tend to be either product-centric, then companies become competition-centric, and then ultimately companies must become what I call customer-centric. Customer centricity becomes a very important area for stabilization of the company for the longer term. So as you can see in the chart, if you remain product-centric and products are getting commoditized, lots of competition is coming from emerging markets for typically old technology products such as transformers, circuit breakers, for example, machines in general. We are not about very smart automated machines, but sort of the dumb mechanical machines by and large. And therefore, you go on a downward spiral because product marketing does not sustain you in the future. You react to competition by adjusting your SKUs, getting out of some markets, as I mentioned, between Mahindra and Mahindra versus, for example, John Deere. But ultimately, my recommendation is first major recommendation would be to become customer-centric. Sounds very easy to do. I mean, idea looks like, how can you go wrong from that concept? But implementation is a major, major problem. We try to implement customer-centric profit and loss centers, even account by account, because Lucent at the time of divestiture only had 9-10 accounts. The 7 baby bells, AT&T, because it was a captive Western Electric company, and of course they had to capture more accounts and have less dependence on their own internal organization. Similar to EDS, which was basically a company that was owned and bought by General Motors for internal business, but they were mandated to make sure that they get an external business at the same time. In fact, the mandate was that more than 50% of the revenues must come from outside GM account, and always. So the problem around here that arisen is that while we may have this idea very right, I remember my days at Lucent and even at Nortel, try to reorganize the company from product-centric P&L, costing, etc., to customer-centric P&L. We just couldn't implement it, so we had to walk away. 4 things come in the way, as you can see in the chart. From customer-centric, the arrow comes down. First one is the culture. Second one is the processes. Third one is the systems. And the fourth one is the structure. So this journey toward customer centricity, while it sounds like the obvious thing to do, it requires a strong leadership in order to make this transformation. And many companies are trying to do, such as, for example, Alcoa on the one hand in aluminum business, to, in fact, other commodity manufacturers. So if I show you that chart, why this is important, this is the typical evolution. Companies have some proprietary technology. If they don't have a patent to protect as much, while the patent is in place, they remain product-centric, very rightfully so, because there is no competition, except cloning, maybe counterfeiting, etc. When competition comes in, for however it comes in, you begin to therefore become more competition-centric, and ultimately competition is basically now equivalent to you, and everybody in the industry becomes customer-centric. So the first key lesson is have customer centricity. What is the advantage of customer centricity? And this chart you will see in several of my lectures. And the reason is that to me, this chart is so fundamental to everything we do in marketing. Again, from a customer centricity viewpoint, what we need to do is to plot revenues from a customer perspective, not a product perspective. So if you take your largest customer, then second largest customer on the x-axis, and you plot them, and on the y-axis is the revenue that you are deriving from those customers, account by account, you will see a highly exponential curve or a rapidly sloping downward curve. This results into what is called Pareto's law in some academic literature, or every B2B salesperson knows it's called a 20-80 ratio. 20% of your customers will give you 80% of the revenue. In customer centricity, what you have to do is to allocate your cost around each account. And in a B2B market, often you are selling directly to the end customer or end user companies. You may have to go through distributors, but then distributors are your customers at the same time. Anybody where you are sending the invoice and the payment is made is your customer, is the definition that we use here. And again, as you would see, on the left side of the curve, the cost is a lot lower than the revenue for that account, and therefore margins are very strong. And obviously, in B2B markets, the competition will always target those high margin accounts, not just high margin products. So you can cream skim those accounts if you're a competitor, and that's exactly what happened between AT&T and MCI, for example. And it is a very important concept to understand, because on the left side, even if a competitor has a higher cost position, your cost curve is much lower because you have scale economies. It does not matter, because what they don't have is cross subsidies. So in this chart, as you can see, there are sort of a hash lines, and you will see those are all accounts where your cost is higher than your revenue, which means you are losing a lot of money, and you are making money from a handful of customers subsidizing other customers. Any form of a cross subsidy across accounts is not sustainable, and that is exactly why this creates a competitive disadvantage. So the idea is very simple, that customers that are highly profitable on the left side should become your key account management, which means you surround them with a team of people so that in fact they get a lot more attention in terms of pre-sales, sales, and post-sales activities. Whereas customers on the extreme right, which are non-profitable, basically you want to outsource those customers to somebody else, which means you exit those accounts. So this rebalancing revenues between profitable customers and not profitable customers becomes very important activity in a B2B market, and primarily because in B2B market, the number of customers are only a handful of customers. As I said, in the case of Lucent, it was no more than 9-10 accounts in the time of the breakup of the Bell system and the creation of Lucent in the process. Nortel would have the same thing. They had accounts for those independent telephone companies in America, or Bell Canada, which was their key internal customer by and large. So this is the first major lesson, namely that you must actually become more customer-centric and have your profitability aligned with your costs. Second key is collaborate with customers and partners. At the top is a typical product marketing. The sales organization is given the responsibility on the supplier side to make a sale. They deal with the purchasing or procurement organization, which is supported by engineering competency and specifications. Purchasing organization makes the orders. It is used internally by the company, primarily, either in manufacturing or in management support, shared services as we call them, kind of an area. If users have any problem in usage of the product, they call the customer support organization of the supply company. And I find in typical large B2B enterprises, the information about the customer related to purchasing organization by the sales department has no linkage actually with the information about the same customers and the markets we have from the customer support organization. So you will see a question mark in the top part of the diagram. This is bow tie model, as we call it. There are a lot of functions in the back that are supporting the sales organization. You have the manufacturing function, who tells you when to have a delivery done. You have the logistics people, you have the legal frameworks, terms and conditions. You have all kinds of functions, IT function. What we do now is that bow tie is reversed, so that those functions themselves between a customer and a supplier work together. And the role of the key account manager is primarily to be a facilitator, a coordinator, more than anything else. Each of the functional people belong to their own organization, which are functional, reporting to a functional head, but they are technically on a loan toward this key account manager, who has now created a virtual team. I've always recommended that key account management is only one-way street and therefore not good enough, which is what the supplier puts together as resources and commitment to the customer. But what about customer's commitment? Does the customer feel also very strongly that they want to partner with you as a great supplier? Or they want to strictly go on delivery and price as a way of what we call a transactional marketing? Are they serious about investing in you as a supplier as you are serious about investing in the customer? So ultimately, when this becomes a major alignment, and it cannot be done across all of your accounts, you have to go for some key accounts where you know this relationship is both operationally very efficient and strategically positioning your future. And eventually it looks more like a joint venture. While you may not have an official joint venture, but you do have a virtual joint venture where customer commits its resources, talent and money and time as you commit your resources at the same time. And there is a procurement person in the customer organization, depending on the level of partnering and engaging, who is assigned as a full-time person facilitating within the customer organization all about the procurement. And same thing on the other side, that you have a full-time key account manager and the two work together as partners or as buddies. This system was put together between Procter & Gamble and Walmart. Remember, while P&G is in consumer products itself as a company, its customer is a retailer, and therefore P&G Walmart is a B2B market. I've done similar work at Whirlpool Corporation, where the key account, in fact, the dominant major account was Sears as a retailer. Whirlpool made Sears brand of appliances called Kenmore, which still dominates. In fact, GE is a distant second or third. Whirlpool has its own brand. That is virtual joint venture for, I don't know, maybe at least 70 years now. Long-term relationship as a supplier and a customer, not as acquiring each other. Retailers generally don't like to be in manufacturing, and generally manufacturers don't like to be in retailing. The competencies are very different, and therefore it's a perfect place for some sort of a virtual joint venture. So back to P&G Walmart story. Procter & Gamble, when they plotted their 1,500 accounts, from the largest customer to the smallest one, they found the same issue. In 90% of their accounts, out of 1,500 accounts, when they put the activity-based costing as a mechanism, it's a huge surprise, they were only profitable in less than 100 accounts. So do you outsource the other accounts? Do you stop doing business with them? What about the revenue that they generate? You cannot show to the stock market declining or stagnant revenues. You have to show growth, at least industry level growth or economic level growth. So what they did was very smart. While they had to serve those accounts, they basically delegated to third-party logistics. Those small independent distributors, $1 billion, $2 billion, actually have to distribute to convenience stores the same P&G brands as they distribute Coca-Cola, as they distribute food items, whatever they do. The biggest customer out of nowhere was Walmart, which they did not even know, because at P&G as a consumer company, you are organized around products that you sell or market for consumers, such as, for example, the vegetable shortening Crisco division, or Folgers coffee, or detergents like Tide, or shampoo like Head & Shoulders Pantene. That's how you are organized. Now they are getting reorganized by having the channel person as a customer, as opposed to just a channel. Very strong mindset change, culture change, and very strong process change. But the journey began, and today it is one of the very large relationships between P&G and Walmart. They have cloned or replicated the same with other large retailers, And of course, they are going global with the same approach wherever there are large retailers where the retailer buys Procter & Gamble products. Very fascinating. If I had more time, I would have given more how this has become much more of a strategic aspect for Procter & Gamble, especially about their acquisition strategies, than one would have ever imagined. For example, they ended up buying personal care cosmetics like a Giorgio, Oil of Olay. They just bought Gillette, made mega prices. Analysts were questioning, but the logic is so compelling because now these products are distributed through other retail channels, let's say department stores or drugstores, and now you bring it to a high volume, high velocity, in fact, a giant retailer who gives you more footprint among consumers than anybody, both in this country and outside, and hence you can pump it through a low margin, gross margin customer. So you can satisfy Walmart with only 40% gross margin in cosmetics, whereas a department store, because of the display and in a shopping center, rents and everything with people, sales clerks on the floor, you have to pay about 300% gross margin for them to make any money. So it becomes a perfect win-win. And I would expect Procter & Gamble to exit businesses which are lower margin businesses and add more portfolio of higher margin products through acquisition, which has a significant impact. Then do you really need your own internal R&D department? Because now you are acquiring technology rather than creating at home in some fashion. All kinds of strategic implications just because of that relationship and changing the mindset totally about who is your customer. That's a very key point. So this is the second thing. Collaborate with your customers and maybe partners. Partners could be peers wherever it's allowed by the government, or partners could be unrelated industry if it is necessary. By the way, in this chart, you will see very interestingly, so many functions are involved. IT is a very key function. So Procter & Gamble and Walmart, the relationship is such that computers to computer transactions are taking place. So when you check out at the checkout counter at Walmart, for example, if it's a P&G product, the scanner data immediately indicates and the P&G gets the money paid. Isn't that interesting? The total cycle of accounts receivable, accounts payable now drops to below 30 days. Usually we used to have a 30-day net plus or net 2 kind of a thing, which means if you pay in time, I give you a discount. Now their accounts receivable is our DSO, as it is called. The amount of DSO is very low. It's under 21 days because computers are creating transactions and basically settling the account on a real-time basis. There are all kinds of advantages behind this transformation, and therefore I really would like to talk about that one. The third key, in order to make sure that the business company really is stable in the future, is to do as much automation and integration as possible, especially with regard to customer-facing functions. So this chart shows you how, with the computerization of the world taking place, which began in the 60s with IBM machines, primarily 7070, 7090, IBM 360, 370, and now the 3300 series. They're all computers becoming servers now more and more. With that infrastructure, we began to first internally automate our back office operations, not customer facing, and integrate them through internal networks that's called intranets. And we created a lower left box called business process automation, became the major event in the 80s, as you might reflect back. And we began to install what is called ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, hardware and software. So you have the Oracle platform, or you have the SAP platform, you have the IBM platform of hardware and software operating systems on which the company's businesses are totally automated. Then you take that automation and integration further north toward your suppliers. which led to a whole new industry called supply chain management. And companies, quite a few came about in supply chain management, such as Manhattan Associates in Atlanta or i2 Technologies in Austin, Texas, and they became billion-dollar IT service providers. This is where Oracle has made significant acquisitions also to make sure that Oracle becomes one-stop shop for their large key accounts or enterprises. So supply chain automation is on the upper left. Once you do that thing, the back office is all automated. Then you do the automation of the front office, which is customer facing. And of course, airlines have gone through this process better than anybody, is my view. And they are basically called computerized reservation systems. Began in the old days of the client and the server. So you have the systems that American Airlines had. You had the systems that United Airlines held, called the Apollo system. And you have a systems that's Delta and those airlines have, called WorldSpan. And these were the standalone systems that primarily had travel agents, everything on the desk, no paper writing tickets, no manual at all. And today, of course, you have seen airline is basically an online business. So you go to the lower right, which is a discipline called customer relationship management, CRMs. In marketing, we talk about quite a lot of CRM platforms. And then, of course, data mining and all this stuff. But ultimately, from there, you move up in the organization's automation and integration toward what is called online marketing or e-commerce. So companies like Amazon begin there, but make sure that their back office and supply chain is all automated. Or companies like Cisco Systems claim that the customers place their orders online only, and 70% of the total business is online procurement, and then they manage the supply. This is a very, very significant change than the traditional legacy manufacturing companies by and large. So legacy companies have the typical process of manufacturing, then selling, then collecting money, then servicing, etc. This is totally reverse. You don't even manufacture till the orders are in place. So it's a reverse marketing, which I will talk about, which I just call it online marketing. And of course, in this particular year, in 2011, you will see online marketing growing fantastically, both for the consumer side as well as for B2B side. But B2B is a lot more online. In fact, most of the industrial catalogs are pretty much now on the web page. So the third key is integration and automation. And we went through the process. The consequence of doing that is literally creating what we are now coining as the connected enterprise. You know, enterprises grow by having functional silos, geographic silos, or product silos. And often most enterprises are still like a cube. And the turf wars between those silos are enormous. And then, of course, you add the corporate silos on top of that, most of the corporate staff functions. It just goes on and on. In fact, in business marketing, the tensions between the sales and marketing organization are enormous. Sales, marketing, which is usually pre-sales activities like market segmentation, branding, positioning, and then post-sales like customer support usually don't get along at all. Problem is that impacts the customer, and a lot of dysfunctionality arises in the process. So with automation and integration, you go from location silos, functional silos, to becoming an integrated organization. And from the time silos, you begin to go online. So ultimately, if you fill all those 4 boxes of automation, starting with ERP, going to supply chain management, SCM, going to CRMs, and ultimately full-blown e-commerce, then you are going to be pretty much a connected enterprise. The next key to success turns out to be redesigning the business marketing as a supply chain. In other words, right now, the way we do marketing is that we have the products produced, inventoried, Sales organization is given quota, and you simply say, go and sell it. That's a product-centric marketing. In customer-centric marketing, it begins with the order first and goes back to the supply chain. And this is a much preferred way. Some people have even called it as reverse marketing. In fact, I remember a book with the title, and very good book in this area. So the reason why this is very important is that sales forecasts are usually not as reliable, and usually they are more optimistic. In fact, I don't trust anything that comes in even as an order, because in large ticket items such as a major system integration in the IT industry, or a major procurement by power substations by a utility company, or a major transformer, or whatever it turns out to be. Think about locomotives, think about very much industrial products. The customer, even after signing the contract, often delays procurement for whatever happens in their organization. Either they have a cash flow problem, they are going through merger acquisitions which is announced, or more likely there is just a delay in receiving the machinery because they don't have other pieces put in place. Just like a project management where there may be delays. So given that, I don't like that till the customer order is not only placed, but the money is committed at the same time. Like an escrow or a letter of credit or whatever it turns out to be. So sales forecasts are less reliable and usually more optimistic. In fact, selling is such a tough function that you have to be always positive about the future. Otherwise, a big downer. So given that nature, the question is relying on sales forecast and hoping that revenues will come creates a quarter-by-quarter nightmare for the business companies, especially to report to the analyst or provide any guidance. So you shift from sales forecast to customer commitments, as I mentioned earlier. As I also mentioned about Procter & Gamble and Walmart relationship, this uncertainty is gone, because as soon as a consumer buys a product which is a P&G product, such as a Gillette blade or a Pantene shampoo or a Tide detergent, when they cash out, there's a record, and immediately there's a commitment made by the customer, in this case Walmart, to pay you the money. Much more reliable than forecasted approach to what the revenues will be. So we can learn quite a lot about this way of reverse marketing, especially from services industries, such as brokerage, where order is placed and it's very fast in terms of its execution in the back office. Or airlines, as we have talked about it in the presentation. And of course, more and more banking services are becoming pretty much web-based now, or even in mobile platforms. Last one is that it makes you focus on delivery and serviceability. One of the biggest complaints I've heard again and again in B2B markets is that even after making the promise as to when you will deliver, often the supplier misses the delivery date. From a supplier viewpoint, it may not matter if you deliver a week later, etc., but from a customer viewpoint, it stops his whole production, his whole operations. And the cost, therefore, of delay is massive. Similarly, once the equipment is bought and you install it and it does not work, factory stops. So you may be only 4 or 5% of the cost to the customer. Its impact, therefore, is magnified, let's say 15, 20 times in terms of lost productivity, in terms of lost revenue opportunity, etc. So it's just like a defect in a product. If you are making a component maker, a small component with only 1/100th of the cost of the total making of an automobile, let's say, if it fails, the whole value add done by the assembler, such as a GM, Ford, Toyota, etc., is enormously very large. And therefore, more you are a smaller supplier, but a strategic component, the more you have to have quality assurance in the process. So it basically says that what matters in excellent B2B marketing is not pleasing the customer. It's not sales presentations, it's not PowerPoint presentations, but what matters is operational excellence. And this principle we have not really focused in marketing literature. So operational competency, operational excellence is absolutely necessary, and therefore if the sales and marketing people can drive that operational excellence by taking a customer perspective, I think it can come out very well. Fortunately, with online procurement now, this happens. I mean, this is the competency of, as I mentioned, Cisco systems, for example. This is the competency at Dell computers. They would not even make the computers till the order is placed based upon specifications design. So it's like a just-in-time delivery. It's just like, lean operations that we talk about. So operational execution is very key as companies become more customer-centric. By the way, I talked about the delivery. I found this very true in one very large company. I don't want to name it. I found fascinating. They sell cellular telephones to satellites. And I found fascinating that they promise a delivery 10 years from now, and 9.5 years later, they will call the customer and say, by the way, we'll be missing the deadline. Isn't that interesting? Because the company is engineering driven. In fact, within the company, there is no respect for salespeople. Salespeople are usually not respected by engineers unless you are an engineer, which I find only in one industry, maybe two, very prevalent, such as, for example, in specialty chemicals, where the chemical engineer usually is the salesperson. Or in pharmaceutical industry, where you really have to have a degree in pharmacology and you are absolutely an expert on pharma technology, you are probably a chemical engineer of some sort, or pharmaceutical engineer for that matter, who becomes a salesperson, or what they call a detailing person. Medical electronics the same way. You have to have the operational or engineering expertise and experience before you become a salesperson. That, I think, is a very key difference, let's say in countries like India and China, where most people go for engineering education and then they become salespeople. Whereas in America especially, we start primarily in sales and marketing function with a business major or economics major having no knowledge of engineering, and therefore there is no internal respect about the sales organization. So which is why this operational excellence becomes a very key piece for the salespeople. The fifth key that I recommend is please outsource non-profitable customers. A dissatisfied customer with no choice is a terrorist. Now, this is not a politically right word to use in the recent times, but this was a slogan that was put on the desk of every manager in one large industrial manufacturing company to make them customer-centric. They're excellent in what they do, but it's a product-centric culture. Remember, a customer who has a choice will walk away. But a customer who is locked in your technology and has to depend on you, and you are not serving them well, like a monopolist attitude, they will become a lot more difficult to manage, and there will be cost causes to you. Neglect of C accounts. As you know, in business-to-business marketing selling, you have the A accounts, B accounts, C accounts. And often a given sales account manager is given the responsibility in a territory where they usually get the revenue for next quarter, next year from A accounts, and everybody neglects the C accounts. The C accounts are not profitable, nobody is able to make a call on them. So the idea here is that rather than simply keep them neglected, it's better to outsource them. In fact, many packaged goods companies do that thing where for smaller distributors and retailers, they can't afford their own salesperson, so they hire a third-party marketing services company, a third-party outbound calling center company, and then they represent the manufacturer. Not as uncommon as we think. So my recommendation here is that neglecting is both ineffective and inefficient. Outsourcing unwanted customers for whatever reason, they may not fit your strategy or they may not be profitable. Whatever the reason is, that actually taking those customers and giving it to somebody else to manage the relationship is better. It is a win-win-win for all three, you, the customer, and the third party. This is not as radical a concept, because every time I made a presentation, people say, you must be kidding. If you outsource the customers, what is left in the business, right? First of all, we are not talking about outsourcing all customers, only those that are not strategic or profitable. And secondly, this is what we do for our internal customers. How much outsourcing of personnel services we do? Payroll is not done by companies anymore. They outsource to companies like ADP. IT department outsources quite a lot to IT services companies like IBM, like Accenture, or Indian IT service companies. We do so much of outsourcing within the company customers. Now we can use the same approach and a model about outsourcing our external customers. But interestingly, we never teach in many courses vendor management. Because if you outsource it, then you need to learn how to manage the suppliers, the third-party suppliers. So it's a different skill set that you have to evolve. So this is the fifth key. Sixth key is, and my favorite, create a separate office of the chief customer officers. Please don't call it chief marketing officer, because the word marketing is associated in their mind as somebody who is strictly into branding, etc., and they have no interest. Internally, it's a very hard cultural resistance to work with or for marketing people. So I have recoined and call it a chief customer officer, and that is account by account responsibility in the hand of this person. And that person now is responsible for sales in a B2B environment, which is the largest marketing effort. Marketing, which is branding, targeting, segmentation, all the stuff we talked about. And post-sales, which is a service account. So service part, sales part, marketing, all comes under this chief customer officer. Chief customer officer also reports directly to the CEO. Very strong recommendation. It's a part of the corporate CXX team. Just like you have a chief financial officer, just like you have a chief human resource officer, if you want to be customer centric, you must have a chief customer officer responsibility. And then they can manage direct account relationship, and they can manage a distributor account relationship, for example. The chief customer officer is also responsible for strategic partnerships, and therefore has to have a capability that goes beyond sales and marketing, and often engaging in potential customer joint ventures. Also, chief customer officer is responsible for business development. If there's a business development officer, he or she reports to the chief customer officer, which means they are really part of the top core management team in the company. Just like the chief operating officer is there, or manufacturing people are there, you now have the chief customer officer. Next is the seventh key. And this is everything about the customer support or customer service organization. I find that with large manufacturers, especially who sell capital goods, such as the aircraft manufacturers, construction equipment manufacturers, machinery manufacturers, packaging machines manufacturers, I can think about all those, large chemical companies even. Once you sell your product and it is installed, there is always a need for maintenance, repair, etc. That revenue actually is quite large when you do the lifetime revenue analysis, that in fact that revenue may be more than 2 or 3 times the initial capital revenue or the machine, sell of the machine that you got it. Unfortunately, most product-oriented companies or manufacturing companies are very finding it difficult to go to services side. Exception is IBM, which starts as a blue box making computers and servers, has been able to make a transition to IBM Global Services, but that's somewhat rare. Other manufacturers have had a hard time, although it is necessity. So commoditization of core products and services is inevitable. In semiconductors, this is just a dog-eat-dog world. Margins are so thin, and the global competition is here, almost behaving like consumer electronics business. And so IBM very smartly, as you know, divested the PC business, ThinkPad, to Lenovo, and in the process has become B2B company primarily, but expanding the services business. And the annuity model of revenue becomes very appropriate in a service, because service is a service contract that you sign. In capital goods, you go buffeted up and down. Think about General Electric selling energy products, or selling, aircraft engines, or selling, in fact, any infrastructure. It's all capital-intensive industries. But services that come along is very important, as it is true for Siemens, as will be true for ABB, in fact, any one of these large capital goods makers by and large. So let me conclude this lecture. Business markets are sensitive to market prices on the one hand, and to external factors such as globalization, especially of competition, disruptive technologies, rapidly changing regulation, and access to capital. Business marketing tends to be product-centric generally. The role of marketing is to support the sales organization. As you know, in consumer marketing, marketing guys are very powerful. The trade guys who sell to the retailers are not that powerful. In business to business, it's just the reverse. Sales guys are most important on the customer side, and the role of marketing is to do sales support, like making collaterals or arranging for conventions where the trade get-togethers with the customers takes place, or etc. It's a more support role, whereas here it says that it should become a key role, not just a support role. That's the key point I'm trying to make here. There are 7 keys to better business marketing, and they are: shift from product to customer-centric marketing, learn to collaborate with customers and partners, and I must tell you, the more technology-based the company is, the more the company has become successful on intellectual property rights, the harder it is for the company to collaborate with customers. And that goes for IBM at one time, that goes for Microsoft, for example, that goes for Motorola, makes no difference. It is very hard for them to collaborate because they want to be in charge. They are basically what I would call control freaks. They're lawyers, they're accounting people, they're negotiating people, pretty much will not allow any flexibility. And we are finding the world is more collaborative with customers. The whole new language we are using is co-creating value with customers is very key. And in that bow chart model I showed you how, if you reverse it, it becomes basically a virtual joint venture. So how do you inculcate that culture in the company is very key. Third is automate and integrate all functions. And today, the automation and integration is so affordable. Think about the price points today versus what was true in the 60s or even 80s for that matter. The cost of computing has become astronomical cheap. Memory chips are so cheap that I actually find storing on my memory chips better than on my piece of paper. And I can have unlimited capacity of storage at virtually very low price points. I'm talking about small enterprises even, let alone large enterprises where you have the huge storage companies that can support, let's say, in cloud computing environment, etc. So automation and integration of customer-facing activities is a third key recommendation to survive and thrive in business marketing. Fourth one is manage the supply chain. In other words, it's reverse marketing. So if you can have more automated way of customer orders coming in, less human intervention goes directly to the assembly people, or if you are a trader, a distributor, goes to manufacturer. And in a B2B, we have to really learn from companies like Grainger and there's another name like that, which is a very big distributor of electrical products. But Grainger is highly respected about its IT platforms. But so is Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro probably sells $60 to $70 billion of IT products, from chips and software, all to their own value-added resellers, about 120,000 of them at least, who basically serve the end customers. So they are a large distributor, and they have their own actually online procurement. It's all B2B, and it goes to manufacturers for replacing the supplies or for buying capital goods pretty much. Next recommendation I have is outsource non-profitable customers. As I mentioned earlier, neglecting is worse than outsourcing. Create Chief Customer Officer. Reporting directly to the CEO is the sixth recommendation. And the seventh is to focus on customer support services as your revenue center and maybe your profit center. Quite often, customer support is primarily a cost center. How do we make it into a revenue center and ultimately a profit center? More and more companies in manufacturing are doing this thing. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture, and I wanted to make sure that we have in the whole library of lectures in the Sheth Marketing Academy something on business to business marketing. Thank you.